So tonight we're really going to talk about how to negotiate or renegotiate the rental rates in your dental office lease, whether you are a new start doctor looking to acquire a practice, build out a new practice, whether you have an existing lease that's coming up for renewal, whether you're considering expanding, possibly relocating, or even transitioning in the next 5 to 10 years. And even if you're only cover some other points of why the lease is so important for the dental tenant. So hopefully tonight this will be an educational course. If you may not walk out of here as experts, but if you can gain any additional knowledge to help you moving forward when it comes to negotiating the dental office lease, then I would have done my job. So I want to start with these three numbers, these three significant numbers, 85, 54, and 80. Now, as you can see, 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent. And 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them a right to at least 50% of the process when the practice is sold. Now, I think it's important to tell you a little bit about Cirrus, who we are, so you understand how we've been representing the dental community for over 25 years now. We are a healthcare and dental specialist tenant representation firm. We were founded by dentists, for dentists in 1994 in Alberta, purely for the reason that the dental tenant was being taken advantage of by the landlord. As you know, it's a very expensive business to enter into, and it can be an extremely profitable business to exit out of. And since and medical office leases, majority of clients are dental tenants, but we do represent many other medical professionals, veterinarians, rheumatologists, general practitioners. We really do specialize in healthcare. We have an in-house legal and leasing and consulting department. And annually, we represent over 500 doctors throughout North America. As you know, tonight's course is a CE accredited course. We do deliver over 100 accredited seminars annually, webinars, and we also lecture at most of the major dental convention centers. As you can see, I think that the Pacific Dental Conference was probably the last event that I actually was at in person in March, just before we went into lockdown, but we really do work with dentists nationwide. So if we just look at some of the sort of market trends and key indicators across Manitoba and Saskatchewan, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty globally in the current climate. But what I would say is, you know, Manitoba, Saskatchewan being a well-diversified economy and its geographic isolation, the economic impact has been less significant when compared to other major markets across North America. We are seeing a further increase in vacancy rates, especially in some of the suburban B and C class markets, which is putting downward pressure on rental rates. But we are seeing it shifting towards more of a tenant-friendly market, where landlords, as an alternative to reducing rental rates, we are seeing them offering increased tenant incentives to attract new tenants as vacancies do rise. We can provide a more detailed look at these, but please bear in mind, it really does depend on the type of property that you may be looking to acquire or you currently are in, and the demographic and the type of landlord when comparing rents. And there is also a premium that a healthcare tenant does have to pay. So what's the purpose of today's webinar? Well, firstly, we want to look at the importance of the office lease agreement. Why is it so important that the healthcare tenant, compared to other tenants, is such a pivotal part of their small business? We're going to look at some of the key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement. And we'll also give some practical advice on negotiating lease agreements. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about buying versus selling versus leasing. I have many doctors that I've represented over a number of years that want to buy their own space and they don't want to rent anymore. So I just want to talk about some of the sort of pros and cons between buying and leasing. Now, when it comes to buying, there is a large upfront financial investment that is required to buy the space. But on the plus side, you become your own boss, you become a landlord. You have much greater flexibility on how you use the space and freedom to control the property. But you do become a landlord. You are now responsible for any problems in the space. If you are a landlord with a multi-tenant space, then you will be responsible if there are any problems. Even if you have a property management company that's looking after the property for you, you will have to facilitate any of these responsibilities. Any problems with plumbing or electrical, they are going to come to you. Now, if you're working as a dentist, you have to take these things into consideration, that it's a full-time job becoming a landlord. Now, if we look at leasing, obviously this doesn't require such a large upfront investment, a much smaller upfront payment, and gives you greater working capital towards building out the practice. And it also gives you the flexibility to relocate or expand. If you are in an area or a demographic, or the space may not be a great size and you're buying that building, what happens if you outgrow the space? What happens if in 5-10 years, the demographic changes completely and you're in an area now that's less attractive? You can't just pick up and the lease expires, just relocate. You own the building. But the common denominator in all of this is the dental office lease. Even if you do own your own building, it is vital that you have a lease in place, an arm's length lease that separates the building to the practice. If in the future you decide to sell your practice and you want to keep the real estate, then you're going to need a lease in place for any buyer that's coming in to value the property. Is going to need to see a lease. And then you're going to decide, what the tenant is then, future tenant that takes over the space, what are they responsible for? What do they have to pay for? So a lot of people that buy their own dental practice and buy their building just think, that's it, I don't have to, I'm not responsible for anything for the landlord, but there is still a great responsibility. So what is a lease? I normally ask this question at all of my seminars, and I get quite a lot of different answers across the room. This is a one-way webinar. A lease is a contract between two parties, in this case, a landlord and a tenant, really detailing from both sides how long is the contract for, how much does one person have to pay, or is the landlord going to receive, and what are their obligations throughout the term of the lease. Now, that is correct, but we like to say it's a check. And it's one of the biggest checks that you will write in your professional working life. Now, most of you may say, you know, the most expensive is buying a house. From a personal side, yeah, that's correct. But from a business, especially a small business, it's a very expensive business to enter into. If we take into account an average square foot, let's say we're paying $5,000 a month base rent. Now, the average dentist statistically will stay at the same location for over 20 years. So if we took $5,000 on an annual basis of $60,000, over 10 years, you're looking at $600,000, 20 years, $1.2 million. And that is just the base rate, that base rent. That does not include any additional rent, any increase with inflation, any additional operating or tax, maintenance and insurance. Now, this is not a bad thing that you get to use someone else's property to build up your own business. There's nothing wrong with leasing, but what I'm trying to educate and what I'm trying to get across at all my seminars and webinars is really how much you will spend over the life cycle of your working career on this lease agreement. Now, the fundamental financials, the rent and the term is obviously important, but what I want to get across to you tonight is, of course, the bottom line is clearly important, but there are a number of legal provisions. I mean, I read leases on a daily basis. They can range anywhere from 20 to 50 pages. And where dentists and where a lot of people make the mistake is they just look at the first page, see what they're paying and for how long, and then most likely put the document in the drawer and really don't know any of their other obligations. So I want to get across tonight the importance of the office lease agreement. So why is the office lease so important? Well, your office location is the foundation of your practice. If you drove in to your space this morning and picked up your usual coffee, parked up outside your space, if there was an eviction notice giving you 30 days to terminate, to leave the space, and you were given 30 days notice, what would you do? You're not a lawyer or an accountant. You're not somebody that can just pick up over the weekend and relocate. You built up a practice, a community, an area, and it's vital, as we will go through tonight, on why this office lease is so important to your business. As some of my friends at Henry Schein can attest, it's an expensive acquisition to buy to build out a practice. It can be anywhere from $150 to $200 per square foot, depending on the location and the demographic. So even if you're looking at an average 2,000 square foot space, you're still talking about $400,000 to build out a practice. And that doesn't include any of the equipment. So it's an expensive business to enter into, but again, that shouldn't put you off, because right now is a good time with markets as they are. There's lots of opportunities, especially when there is uncertainty, there is also opportunity. But it can be also very difficult and expensive to move if you were forced to move. It's okay if you are looking to build your own practice or you're relocating and you have time on your side and leverage. But if you are forced out of your location because of how the lease is written, and there is some verbiage that gives the landlord right to either terminate the lease or relocate you to another side of the plaza, on average, it can take 8 to 12 months to move, and that can be very stressful and time consuming. And also the practice sale, as we will dig into a little bit deeper further on. It's extremely important to make sure that the lease, whether you're looking to sell in 10, 20, 30, 50 years time, that the lease is structured to give you the ability and flexibility and enable you to sell the practice and not leave any money on the table when it comes to selling the practice. And also, it gives you leverage. If there's other people, if there's other vacancies in the space, the dental tenant has become much more, especially in the last year during COVID, more of the anchor tenant, where we're seeing a big shift with a lot of retail businesses going out of business. You will see a lot more vacancies and a lot more for lease signs, I'm sure, on your way to work. You have become an extremely important tenant. Like I said, you stay at your space for minimum of 20 years. You have the lowest default rate in the country. And I just want to get that point across, that when signing a lease for a long-term commitment, that you understand what you are getting involved in and what you can negotiate. So the next slide, we look at some of the key sellable components of your practice. So when it comes to appraising your practice, if you're looking to sell in the future, we take into account what the equipment. We're also going to look at goodwill. What does goodwill mean? Your patient charts, your reputation in the community. How do you evaluate on buying a space and what it's worth when we've looked at the equipment and the goodwill? The lease can impact 100% of the sale of the practice. Many doctors make the mistake. They'll have their practice appraised. They'll put it on the market. They will have some interest. There'll be 2 or 3 people who put their hands that they're interested and submit an offer, which will get accepted along the line. And then the 25th hour, you realize that you actually have to ask and get permission from the landlord to transfer the selling doctor to the new buyer. And that really does hinge on what is written in your lease and how the landlord can make it extremely difficult when it comes to selling the practice, as they know that normally there's a large transaction and financial transaction that's going to take place during this time. So what should your office lease do for you? If you had a magic wand, what would you want your office lease to do for you? So you'd want it to provide fair and affordable financial terms. So what do I mean by this? You want to make sure that you're paying market rates, fair and affordable. If you're paying additional common area maintenance costs, your tax and maintenance and insurance, you want to make sure what you are paying for, you're actually getting. Landlords have become extremely savvy and they will pass on as many costs as they can, and that enhances the value of their property and they can make their tenants pay for it, then they will do that. So what can we do to make sure that you are, number one, paying fair and affordable financial terms? Because if we make the mistake of signing into a long-term lease, even though we recommend signing a long-term lease, we want to make sure that we've done research on the rental rates, the demographics, to make sure that you are paying what's fair value. And also when it comes to operating costs and additional expenses, we want to have a detailed itemized statement, even a right to audit, so we know exactly what we're paying for. We also want to have long-term stability and security. Now, many doctors I speak to, they sign a 2-year lease, and every 2 years they're having to renew the lease, and that most likely the rents will increase. And they're not really giving themselves any sort of long-term stability or runway. If we are spending that amount of money investing in our practice, whether we've built out from scratch or we've acquired a retiring doctor's practice, there's still a large investment that you've made. So we want to make sure that we have long-term stability. We recommend a 10-year term with as many 5-year options as possible, rather than having a 2 or 3 or 5-year lease that having to renew every couple of years or running out of term. We do not want to get into a position where we don't have enough term. I think a lot of dentists make the mistake that they don't want to tie themselves in for too long. But if you have a well-structured lease that enables you to transfer and assign the lease, and you're in a good location, you have a good demographic, then it shouldn't be a problem coming to sell the practice in the future. We also want to minimize risk and exposure. So what do I mean by this? Many leases that I read today, and it still amazes me that they are personally signed. Now, when you first acquire or build out a practice, there is a good chance that you will have to provide a personal guarantee. Like in any transaction, the landlord, they don't know your credit history. They don't know if you're actually capable of making the payments for a long period of time. But what we want to do, we don't want, if we've signed a personal guarantee, we don't want that to remain for the duration of your working career. So we want to minimize the potential risk whereby the landlord, if you were to default, could come after you personally and come after some of your personal assets. Now, when you're just starting out, you may have a lot more debt, may not be a concern, but as you get older and into your 40s and 50s and you've paid off a lot of your debt and you become more cash rich and have more capital, then there's more risk if something was to go wrong, that the landlord can come after you personally. And also what happens, God forbid, there's an accident, you're unable to practice wet finger dentistry, whether it's from being incapacitated or worst case scenario, you pass away. We like to insert a death and disability provision into all leases that we negotiate. If you've signed a lease for 10 years and 2 years into the lease, something happens, your family, your estate is still liable for the remaining term of the lease. Now, what this death and disability provision can do, it can enable your estate to terminate the lease agreement regardless of the number of years remaining. Now, there may be a small amount to pay in the initial 3 or 6 months to use this provision. But this is just some of the provisions that we provide, that we recommend, that can minimize some of your liabilities. And we also want to maximize your flexibility. So what do we mean by this? We want to make sure that if you are leasing the space, that you have the first right of refusal to take over an adjacent space if it becomes available to you. You don't want to be at your space and see that the next door is vacant, and then suddenly somebody else moves in and you think, wow, that would have been perfect for me to expand. But you know nothing about it and you have no right to even be involved in that conversation. If we have a right of first refusal, whether that is to lease some of the adjacent space may become available, or even the right to buy the building, depending on the space itself. In some cases, it's not going to happen. But in other cases, you want to have the first right of refusal if the landlord decides to sell the property. So this maximizes some of your flexibility. And also, we want to enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. Like I said, if your practice is appraised for $500,000, $1 million, whatever it is worth at the time, it's vital. And I can't stress this enough, as you'll see a little bit further on when we look at some of the technical legal jargon and how this can actually affect the eventual sale of your practice. But it really comes down to what it says in the lease as why, and we see it every day. And a lot of our referrals are based on when someone's looking to sell their practice and they come across a problem which they should have dealt with a long, long time ago. So what's in your lease? So this is an option to renew provision found in 90% of dental office leases. As you can see, it says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as a tenant. Now you can see that Dr. Joe Black is all capitalized, meaning the tenant and nobody else. If Dr. Joe Black remains as the tenant and has regularly paid its rent and performed its covenants, it shall have the option to renew this lease for a further 5 years. Now, I was speaking to a doctor in Winnipeg recently who told me that he was looking to transition and that he had 12 years left on his lease. And when I actually looked at the lease and reviewed it, turned out that actually he only had 2 years left on his lease and 2 5-year options, which were not transferable. They were given by the landlord specifically for him as a tenant, and only if he was to remain as a tenant. Now, suddenly, when he's looking to sell his practice and he thinks he has a lot more term on his lease remaining, the landlord says, well, no, I gave those 2 5-year options, I gave them to you. I didn't give them to anybody else. And if the new buyer wants to negotiate some further term, then he's going to have to pay some additional rent. So you can see here as well, there are some other provisions within this option to renew clause found in 90% of leases. There are 4 or 5 red flags just in this one provision. I really want to focus on the assignment provision. The assignment and sublet provision, again, this is found in 75% of dental leases that we review. And what the assignment provision really does, it enables you to assign the lease to another party, normally in conjunction with the sale or an acquisition of the practice. So I want to look at this in a little bit more detail. So it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. Now here it doesn't say anything about being unreasonably withheld. Now you will have to get consent from the landlord, that is normal. He's not just going to sell to anybody. And written requests shall be in writing. Now the landlord has 3 options in this lease. 1, to simply approve the tenant's request to assign the lease. 2, can decline the tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises. And 3, terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So just by you asking the question of asking to assign the lease, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease agreement within 30 days. Now, if you've agreed the sale of your practice and at the last minute you're just looking for, the landlord to approve the assignment and they can just terminate the lease, what does that do? What does that do to the sale of your practice? Additionally, the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the term, during the remainder of the term, or the greater of then current market rent for leased premises, or 15% greater than the current market rent. So just by, again, asking for permission to assign the lease, as it says here and it's written, the landlord can say, sure, no problem, I'm happy to assign the lease to the new buyer, but I'm going to increase the rent by 15%. Now, I can tell you for a fact, as we do advise quite a lot of buyers who send in their leases for us to review, when they're looking to buy a practice, and they ask us to review the lease that they're going to be taking over for any liabilities. If I saw something like this in the lease, the first thing that they're going to do is drop their asking price by 15%. Now, furthermore, should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, goods, any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of the lease, as it states here, the landlord is entitled to the difference between the annual rental rate or any such goods, rental income, other consideration shall be paid to the landlord directly within 30 days of the tenant's receipt thereof. Now, the landlord knows that there's a large financial transaction that's going to take place in an assignment. And what it's saying here is the landlord is entitled to some proceeds of sale. Now, if you're selling your practice for $500,000 and you pay an annual rental income of $60,000, then the landlord here is entitled to $440,000. All your long blood, sweat, and tears that you've worked for 30 years or more, and suddenly the landlord is entitled to that consideration. And I can tell you for a fact, because I've seen it, that I've seen this happen on numerous occasions. whether the landlord was able to get the full $440,000. But I have seen tenants selling their practice for well over $1 million, having to pay some sort of consideration just to get the landlord to agree to the assignment. So it's vital that we know, one, what is in your lease currently, and two, we make the necessary changes so that the landlord isn't entitled to any consideration should you sell your practice. His argument may be, well, you've been at my location for 25, 30 years. My locations help build up your practice, help build up your value. Process. And then even after you've agreed with the landlord to assign the lease to a potential buyer, it says, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So even if you've agreed to assign the lease to an associate or a new buyer, if that associate defaults on the lease, you are still on the hook. And if we go back to that personal guarantee, or you've signed personally, you can still be on the hook, and the landlord can come after you even after you've sold the practice. So again, this is just one provision that has at least 5 red flags just in the assignment provision. And this is found in 75% of dental office leases. So what are some of the other critical business impacting clauses within a lease? Now, I'm not going to go through every one of these because we certainly don't have enough time tonight. You may have a demolition clause or a relocation provision in your lease that can enable the landlord to give you a small amount of notice to terminate the lease or relocate you to another space, which may not be the same as what you're currently used to. We talked about the death and disability provision, but as you can see, there is 20 or so other provisions that get overlooked. So this is a slide that we've actually managed to pull from the landlord side. This is a tenant lease cycle. Now, the key here is, as we recommend, knowing exactly any critical dates, when your expiry is coming up, if you have any options, what's the notice period on your options? Because the landlord, they really want to get you out of this blue line. This is why we recommend starting the process at least 2 years before expiry to give us the leverage. One, if they start to take time, and two, if there is an issue, if we do need to relocate, if we do need to switch gears and look for another space, that we have enough time, that we're not coming up to the amber and the red, where the landlord really wants to get you down to this stage here, because they know with the less time you have left, then the likelihood is you're not going to move and you run out of leverage, and they know that you're pretty much going to sign anything that they put in front of you. So it's key to start to engage the landlord at least 24 months before expiry. And you will get lots of landlords that will say, we've got plenty of time, they'll put you off, but they know what they're doing. They do this every day. They negotiate leases every single day, like we do. And it's really just about educating the landlord. We just don't want to get to a point where we're in a situation where we really don't have much choice. We want to have as much flexibility and choice to make our own informed decisions, whether that is staying at the space, renewing, or moving. We just want to be able to choose that at our own time. Now, during COVID, we have seen, some unprecedented opportunities where it comes to lease renewals. Landlords are certainly feeling the pressure to secure a longer term tenant, as the healthcare tenant for sure is someone that they are looking to negotiate with. They know that there is lots of other vacancies. They know that whether you want to do that or not, you could move. You could go somewhere else. So there's opportunities to reset financials now. There's opportunities, if we are looking to stay in the same space, to negotiate a longer term lease with more favorable terms. And especially for new starts, we are seeing a lot of new start clients because there is a lot of spaces that have become available, whether it's some of the new builds, and landlords are offering good extreme incentives, whether it's tenant improvement allowance, free rent, fixturing periods, and financing is at some of the lowest rates in our lifetime. And I'm sure that Henry Schein would love the opportunity when it comes to some of their equipment and supplies to look after you and give you some really great options to walk through if you are looking to start a new practice. Because landlords do become desperate to fill vacancies. So what are some of the strategies and tactics that we, Cirrus, use to provide this success that we've had for over 25 years now? If you look at our Google reviews, we've had over 100 5-star Google reviews. The majority of clients have said it's the best money that they've spent on their practice. Now, why are we successful? Well, we gather all the documentation. We make sure we have all the information. We then identify your practice and career goals. We look at where you are now in your working life and where you want to get to. And we want to align the lease. We want to align the strategy to be in line with your practice and your career goals. We would then review the office lease for any risks. We prepare market research. We can pull data and some of the current rental rates, vacancy rates, and comparables. And then we develop a strategy and an outcome. And all of this that we've done, all these 5 steps we've done, and this is all before we've even reached out or approached the landlord. Many doctors, and please don't do this, I don't want you to even be alarmed, because there are a lot of these things that are and may well be in your leases. The worst thing you can do is ring up your landlord and say, I want this removed, I want that removed. Because again, as I say, they negotiate leases. Their job is to get the best for their landlord side. We then would spend probably 20, 30 hours back and forth on the lease, negotiating some of the economic and financial parts of the lease. And then we'll look at some of the lease negotiation terms, spend 20 to 30 hours on the back and forth, negotiating some of the legal provisions until we have a final review executed lease that you're satisfied with. Now, we do have what we call a critical dates and risk analysis, which is $1,500 value, whereby we would spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for any traps, any areas of concerns, any liabilities, any critical dates. We would then get on a scheduled call, discuss your visions, your plans, and we would come up with an effective treatment plan about how we effectively negotiate the lease going forward. Now, thanks to our sponsors at Henry Schein, and for those of you who have joined tonight's webinar, Henry Schein has kindly sponsored tonight's course, enabling everybody to have a complimentary lease consultation. Whether you have a lease or not, you're still entitled to this consultation. If you're looking to start a practice, we can certainly help and have a conversation to see where you're at, what stage you're at, and how we can actually help with some of our knowledge and brain trust. What I would say is that this is on a first come, first served basis. So I would encourage you to fill out the questionnaire, the poll that you can see that's just come on your screens now. And also, if you do want the benefits of this complimentary consultation lease review, you can see my email. If you email at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, that's my direct telephone number if you do have any additional questions. But it is on a first come, first served basis. As soon as I receive your lease agreement, we will go through that and then we will connect to set up a time to speak. So if you could just take a minute to fill out this questionnaire, talking about whether you're presently a tenant, if you have a lease, when it expires, is your situation urgent? If you are interested in the complimentary lease review or a rent analysis of a certain demographic or area that you're looking to start a new practice. I just want to take 2 minutes before we finish just to go through some questions and answers. If any of you do have any questions, please don't hesitate. There is one question that's come in saying, well, what happens if my landlord doesn't want to negotiate? Well, it's a good question. We do get asked that a lot, I would say. And the answer to that, it doesn't happen. Because we're not going in guns blazing, we're not trying to upset any relationships. In majority of cases, we've actually enhanced the relationship. We do appreciate that you have to work with this person for a longer period of time. But when we educate and explain that we're building a business, we've invested a lot of money into the space, and we want to sign a long-term lease, there's a number of provisions that really shouldn't be in there, and educate the landlord, because the bottom line, the landlord, they have to answer to their shareholders, and it comes down to their bottom line, their rent roll. How much are you going to be paying and for how long? So it doesn't really happen, but the landlord doesn't want to negotiate. And like I said, if you're in a position, as long as you have enough time, and if your landlord, if you've been paying rent every month for the last however many years, then maybe you're not in the greatest place. Maybe you do need to consider your options. The one thing that the last 9 months has taught me is many of the dental tenants who thought that they had a great relationship with their landlord have found out that actually they didn't have a great relationship. They paid their rent every month, and they thought that they had a good relationship because they were paying rent every month. But what was the landlord really doing for you? And when it came to COVID, when it came to asking for some deferments on rent, we soon found out that the relationships were a purely business relationship, and everything is negotiable. See if there's anyone else have any additional questions. Just give everyone a minute or so to fill in this questionnaire. So that does conclude tonight's continuing education seminar. I really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their evening to join tonight's course. I hope that you found it beneficial and that you learned something. Like I said, you may not walk away as experts. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a great evening.